Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to my top 5 reads of 2019. I read 70 odd books in 2019, but these are the books that I have cherry picked from that number, and they're not necessarily all published in 2019, but they're books that I read in 2019. So I just wanted to spotlight them so that you can chat with me about my favourite books. My first choice is probably one that you can predict if you've been on my channel for a while, because I've not stopped raving about this book and I constantly recommend it, and it's the Broken Earth series. It's the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. This book is a split perspective book and it mainly follows a character named Esun, and she is an Origin, which means that she can manipulate the magic in this world. And that means that she can connect with earth and nature and kind of manipulate and control the volatility of it, because this is an apocalyptic fantasy book and the earth is constantly shifting and moving and changing, and it poses quite a danger to the people living in it. To put it simply, it's kind of like an elemental magic, and it's where lava and earth would be combined and you'd be controlling the fallout of that. So that's essentially what the magic system is like in this book. To sum it up very briefly, it's obviously a lot more nuanced than that, but that's the easiest descriptor I can manage. This world that Esun lives in endures dramatic climate change, and every few hundred years it really shifts and becomes very apocalyptic and becomes very dangerous for the people living in it. And the people call this a season, so that's why the book is called the 5th season. They're currently experiencing a season, as Esun is also on this quest to find something. So when Esun came home one day, she realized that her husband had murdered her son, who is an Origin, and they're kind of feared and frowned upon because they can get out of control if their ability isn't trained very early. So her husband has murdered her son and then stolen her daughter, and so she has to go on this quest to track them down. Obviously, I ended up loving this book, and I thought I would be thrown off by the inclusion of the second person narrative, but I barely even noticed it. It was seamless, it blended in so well. Second person, if you didn't know, is when the book directly addresses the reader. So it's you did this and you spoke to that person and you lay down in bed. So it really involved the reader, but I didn't notice it as something that was jarring, and it didn't remove me from the story. So that was just an added bonus on why I really enjoyed this book. And in addition to that, there was also the inclusion of diversity pretty much across the board. To name a few, there is a polyamorous relationship, and there's also a significant trans character in this series as well. And I just really love how effortless the inclusion of diversity was, and it was just really beautiful to see as well. It was just so carefully and wonderfully written, and I just want to see more fantasy books that include characters like this, because it wasn't just one token queer character, it was a bunch of characters across the board. It just made it the norm, and that's one of the reasons that I really loved this book. So honestly, this trilogy is just incredible. If you haven't picked it up yet, please go and do so, because it has just become one of my favorites of 2019, and I'm just so happy that I read the entire trilogy back to back, because it can get a little bit confusing with the characters and the world building if you don't read them while things are fresh in your head. You're probably going to need to reread it, or at least look up a Wikipedia page or something, because the magic system and the characters and everything going on is very complex, and so if you don't have that sorted out when you read the rest of the series, then you might get a little bit muddled. My next pick is In an Absent Dream by Seanan McGuire, and this is technically the 4th installment in Seanan McGuire's Wayward Children series. Like I said, it's technically the 4th installment, but it tells Lundy's story, and Lundy we met in Every Heart a Doorway, and that's the first book. So if you wanted to just read this one before you start Every Heart a Doorway, you can definitely do so. It stands alone, and it's quite easy to read this one and then read the rest of the series. So if you just want to pick up this book and see how it goes, I highly encourage you to do so, because obviously I loved it. Lundy is a girl who would honestly rather study and dream than become the traditional things that are expected of a woman, and she ends up finding a doorway through to this portal world that really encourages bargaining and logic and trading, and it's basically her paradise. But in this world that is founded on logic and reason, there is a significant danger to it as well, especially if you do it wrong. Of course, at the beginning of the book, Lundy very much adapts to the way these bargains work, and she kind of thrives on them and does really well. But even though she sees it as her paradise, we know that that's not necessarily the way that these novellas turn out. They're very realistic and also raw, but also very genuine as well. And that's one of the reasons that I love this series so much. I also really loved the friendship element that we get to see in this with Lundy and the person that she meets. When Lundy goes back to her world and then back to the Goblin Market, we get to really see a contrast, and I liked seeing that and the family dynamic that she was involved in as well. And one of the things I absolutely adore adored about this was the message that it ended up sending about children. Because I read it like 12 months ago, I'm going to muddle this up a little bit, but I basically said that the adults' expectations and children having a debt owed to them after experiencing terrible things is the thing that made me tear up in this book. I loved the significance of it and the ramifications that had. And you really just see the ripple effect of bargaining and expectations. And it's the first one in this series that I've given a full 5 stars. The rest of this series have sat on 4 or 4.5 stars, but this is my first 5 of the series. Seanan Maguire gets to explore a character in such a short space of time, and I'm always 100% invested in the characters by the end of the novella. And this book was definitely no different. I loved it for that reason. I loved the messages it sent, and I loved Lundy as a main character as well. She was brilliant and so smart. And of course I teared up in it, so obviously it had to hit me emotionally as well, and I just loved it. So if you haven't read the Wayward Children series, you're concerned about starting the books and waiting until the 4th to get to here, you can read this first and then start Every Heart a Doorway. So I would encourage you to read it. Please pick it up. It was amazing. So I tried not to include conclusions to the series in this video, but the way I responded to this and the way that I just loved this book so much, I couldn't not include it. And it is The Burning White by Brent Weeks. This is the last installment in the Lightbringer series, and the first book is called The Black Prism. This series very much explores characters and their blind spots, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But our main character, I guess you could call him, because it's quite split perspective in this adult fantasy series, there are a lot of characters, but our main ones that we kind of start off with are Kip, and he is a 16-year-old boy. He lives in this backwater town, and he kind of realizes he might have a bit of magic. And we also follow a character named Gavin Guile, and he is the prism, so he can control all different streams of magic, and he's quite powerful. He also has a very powerful political role and position in politics at the court as well. And the prism is basically in charge of stabilizing and keeping the balance of the world as we know it, basically, which is a lot of pressure. So as you probably already know, I'm a huge sucker for a magical school, and this series has a very significant magical school in it, so that's one of the reasons I loved it. At this magical school, people train to become part of the Blackguard, and the Blackguard are guards basically for the prism and for the queen in this world, and just for all of the higher ups in political power. There's also a very complicated political system, and there are a lot of betrayals and reveals as this series goes on, but this was just incredible in the way that things were revealed. And obviously I couldn't predict anything, but it took like 2 or 3 books of build up for one line of dialogue in this, and that line of dialogue both made me laugh and also blew my mind. So that is the amount of depth this series gets into. It was just phenomenal. I also love this for the very detailed and the very extensive magic system, and I'm not really going to do it justice explaining it here, but it definitely involves color and light, and so characters can manipulate light and basically transmute it into a physical form, and that is the very basic way of describing what the magic system in here is like. But it's very nuanced, it's very detailed, and it's very textural, and I would highly encourage you to read it if you just like to read about an awesome magic system, to be honest. The most stripped back basic premise of this book, or rather The Black Prism, which is the first in the series, the most basic description I can give you of what the plot is kind of about is that Kip is a 16-year-old boy. He is from this backwater town, and it gets invaded and attacked, and this is the beginning of a war. So a war is breaking out, and Gavin Guile finds Kip, brings him back to his city, and enrolls him in this magical school. And that is a very basic premise, and I'm trying my best not to accidentally spoil things, so I won't talk about it too much. But holy heck, this was so good. It was so rich in nuance, humour and surprises. No character was simply heroic. They all had their faults and all of their shining moments separately and for different reasons as well. I did listen to the audiobook of this, and there were so many times when I was listening to the ending of this and I was just wowed, and I had to stop what I was doing and just stand and stare at the wall, because things that were happening in this book, I couldn't comprehend anything else outside of what was going on because it was so epic. I will push you to deep dive into this series. I know they're a commitment because this is almost 1,000 pages long, and I know that the first book can be fairly divisive when it comes to people's enjoyment of it, and I think that really pivots on Kip's narration. But I did find him frustrating but enjoyable, and I liked his sense of humour. Brent Weeks, like I said, writes from blind spots, and one of Kip's blind spots is that obviously that he's quite young and he's not very worldly, and so some of the things he talks about, you kind of look at him and give him a bit of a side eye like, dude, that's not okay. And there are also characters in this who are accustomed to slavery. But because this takes place outside of those characters' viewpoints as well, it gives you a real contrast as to what the world is like and what these characters are actually like, and that these issues aren't necessarily the be all and end all, and that they can be combated in a particular way, and that these characters' views aren't necessarily the right ones. They're just the views that the character has grown up with because of the way that they've been immersed in their particular culture. And I really like that nuance to it, and I like that there's a chance to investigate and explore those themes in a way that is character focused as well, because it just gives so much more depth and breadth to the story. And also an opportunity to develop and deconstruct characters. And I like that they get really stripped back and really built up. It's such a brilliant story with so much contrast in it. And that's why I would encourage people to pick it up and continue on reading it, because this conclusion is probably going to be my favorite book of 2019. I adored it so much with my entire heart, and I just want to reread this series so much, but I know there's such a commitment and I have a ton of other fantasy to read that I haven't even started yet, but I will be rereading these in the future. So definitely pick them up. This fantasy series is definitely worthy of being described as epic, and like I said, it's one of my favorites. And it was just amazing. I'm actually surprised at my second to last choice. I didn't think it would make this list, and it's an absolutely remarkable thing by Hank Green. This really came out of left field for me. It was kind of on my radar, but I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. So it follows a girl named April May, and she is a 20-something, she's 23 years old, and she is living in New York City, and she's doing this really underpaid job as a graphic designer. And one day she's walking home from work in New York, and she walks past this statue at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and she films a video in front of it with her friend, and then they post it to YouTube and go to sleep, and then the next morning it has just absolutely blown up. Everyone has gone insane over this video because this statue, even though April May just thought it was an art installation, there's more than one. There's at least 40 that have cropped up in every major city across the globe, and she is one of the ones who has basically had first contact with this statue before all of them got cordoned off by security so that people couldn't go near them. This book really addresses social media, internet fame, expectations and pressures, and the friendships behind all of that. And first and foremost, why I really liked this book was because April May isn't necessarily a likable character. She does some things that I really sat back and questioned her when she was doing them, but at the same time, even though she seemed selfish at certain parts of the story, I still understood all of her decisions, and I could still get on board with what she was doing because I understood the angle that she was attacking things from. So I think that really makes for an interesting character when you can sit back and go, I don't necessarily agree with that, but let's ride this roller coaster and see where you're going because I understand what you're doing. And that's definitely what Hank Green did with writing April May, and that's why I loved this book a lot. I was interested in her from the beginning, during the middle, and at the end. This book didn't coast, and I was concerned that it might, but it didn't at all. This is a first contact with aliens story, but it's more of a new adult kind of contemporary book that has a bit of sci-fi flavor mixed in. So if you're a contemporary reader only and you pick up this book, I think you'll love it anyway. And if you're just a straight up sci-fi reader and you pick up this book, I think you'll love it as well. And I kind of fall in the middle of both of those. I pick up contemporary every now and then, and I love reading sci-fi and I love reading fantasy. So this was a perfect amalgamation of the best of both worlds. And again, because of that unique flavor and the combination of internet fame and social media and the fact that it was a fairly modern story, I really liked that about it. It was also super relatable and surprisingly funny as well as being gripping. I'm really hyped up for the sequel to this book. I didn't realize it was going to be a series when I read it, and it doesn't really end on a cliffhanger, so if you want to just read the first book and see if you like it, you can do that as well. But the sequel comes out in July and I'm very excited for it. And then my last pick for this video is The Tyrant's Tomb by Rick Riordan, and this is the fourth book in his Trials of Apollo series, with the fifth book coming out this year in 2020. In The Tyrant's Tomb, Apollo travels to Camp Jupiter, where he basically must learn what it becomes to be a hero or die trying. So the basic premise for The Trials of Apollo, so that I'm not going to talk just about The Tyrant's Tomb because obviously it's the fourth in a series and I don't want to spoil anything, is that Apollo is now in the human world as a 16-year-old boy called Lester, and this is because he offended Zeus and Zeus kicked him out of Olympus, and now he has to kind of go on these quests with these heroes and find his humanity and learn what it means to have proper emotional connections, and we really see that develop in this book, and that's why I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. While Apollo is on a quest with some of the other characters to relocate and restore the oracles. This book didn't just focus on the humor of their situations, it really focused on the character relationships as well, and not necessarily romantic either, which is what I really like to see. And if you know me, then you know that magical school, like The Burning White, is one of my book buzzwords, and then Chosen Family is another one of my book buzzwords, and this had a really deep strengthening of Chosen Family, and that is why I really connected with this book. Like I said earlier, Apollo does discuss love in this book, and while he did acknowledge romantic love, he also acknowledged friendship love as a deep trust as well, and I really loved seeing that so much. It was done in such a candid, beautiful but respectful way, and it had me tearing up so much at different realizations that the characters had about themselves and each other, and it was just so wholesome. I don't see friendship developed as much as a relationship in books that I read, and I'm not quite sure how to phrase that, but I often see romantic relationships as the thrust of the relationship developed in a story. But in this, because it follows a group of characters on a quest, they really have to focus on each other and themselves as friends, and their bond and strength and trust builds with each book. And while the others were based a lot more on humor and one-liners, Apollo was really tapping into his emotions of late, and that really came to the forefront in this story about how he talked to other people and how he understood them as well. Apollo has really grown in depth and nuance, and of course I'm excited to continue on with this series. I thought it was going to be 4 books long, but there is going to be a 5th installment, and I think it comes out at the end of 2020, so like August, September, but it is so good and I love this series, so definitely start it if you haven't yet, because it is just beautiful. So there you go, that concludes my top 5 books of 2019. Definitely let me know if you've read any of these books, or if you're going to go and pick them up now that I have talked about them. I would love to hear from you, but thank you so much for watching. I will chat to you in the comments, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.